My number 3 pick for Star Trek The Next Generation is A Matter of Perspective, also directed by Cliff Bole and written by Ed Zuckerman. Now, I think that this episode is one of the better written episodes of Star Trek The Next Generation, and I had never heard of Ed Zuckerman, so I looked him up, and this is the only episode of Star Trek The Next Generation that he wrote. And I'm glad that he did, because it is one of my absolute favorites. It's my number 3 in my top 5.
Perhaps you had better tell me as much as possible.
I love the opening in this episode. Before a line of dialogue emerges, we get these 3 individuals that are painting, and Picard looks at the model, and he looks at his painting, and all he can do is sigh. He can't quite figure out the picture. He can't put it all together. And this is going to be Picard's arc in the episode. At the end of this episode, Picard is going to be the person who has to put all of the pieces together. And so this is a wonderful opening that occurs without even a word of dialogue. Now, once the dialogue starts, then we're able to see the framing device of the episode, which is perspective.
Lieutenant Wright has effectively fused the incongruities of the surrealists with the irrationality of Dadaism.
All 3 of these people are painting the same subject, but what they have on their canvas is quite different. One of the things I love about this episode is that they actually show us the paintings. I was surprised that we got to see all 3 of the paintings. So the production design did a good job on this episode. Data comes in, and he starts talking about the other people's paintings, and then he gets to Picard's.
Interesting.
And he belittles Picard's amateur effort. Some of the words that he uses are inappropriate, disparate, haphazard, and unsettling. Not exactly the kind of words you want to hear when you're embarking on an artistic endeavor. This episode opens with Geordi coming back to the Enterprise, and Picard says, "Hey, how'd it go?" And Geordi's like, the mission went fine, but...
Any problems?
Not with the scientific part of the mission, no sir.
A moment later, Riker gets ready to come back, and it's very exciting. The space station explodes. We don't know if Riker made it back. O'Brien's trying to get him back, and Riker makes it back. And we learn that the scientist who was aboard the station is killed, and we get to see Jonathan Frakes just act the heck out of that moment. The planet's chief inspector arrives almost immediately to take Riker into custody. He just shows up, and when he gets to the bridge, Riker just starts yelling at this man that he's never met.
Murder? Now wait a minute, you can't come on.
This is not an episode that shows Riker in the best light, except for in Riker's perspective, which we'll get to in just a minute. Picard and the inspector meet together where the inspector says that in their society, people are guilty until proven innocent. Well, Picard, he's not going to let that just happen.
If I understand Federation regulations on this matter, and I just happened to look them up before
I am aware of Federation regulations, sir.
The inspector says that they have to recreate, moment by moment, the incidents leading up to the scientist's death. And Picard has an idea. And he says that we can basically recreate it. We can recreate this moment on the holodeck. So he calls in Data, and there's this wonderful moment where Riker kind of peeks his head in, where in this episode, Riker just looks guilty as sin in everything that he does, and Jonathan Frakes does a really good job of making Riker look guilty as sin, especially when he's trying to get his head through the door. Picard decides that they're going to hold an extradition hearing on the Enterprise where he's going to hear the evidence against Commander Riker and determine if Riker is going to be extradited to the planet. Picard is our main character in this episode. He is the one who is going to determine Riker's fate.
May I have a word with you?
Under the circumstances, number one, I think that would be inappropriate.
It starts with Picard. Picard has to make this decision, and Picard has to make the ultimate decision. So the framing device of the episode is that three individuals are painting different pictures of the same subject. And that's what happens with the story of the episode as well. We get the perspective of the three people involved in this altercation on the station. Riker, the scientist, and the scientist's wife, now a widow. In Riker's perspective, Riker does things by the book. He is polite, he's diplomatic, he's a victim of circumstances. He meets with Dr. Apgar at the end, and he basically says that everything is just a misunderstanding. In Riker's perspective, the wife suggests that Riker stays on the station.
Commander, I insist you and Mr. LaForge stay with us.
I hardly
know
think...
that you would prefer to be left alone with your very important work.
In Riker's perspective, the wife seduces him and creates the circumstances leading to the confrontation with Dr. Apgar. She shuts the door, she's lonely, she disrobes. And in Riker's version, Dr. Apgar hits his wife, then takes a swing and misses Riker. This is important because it shows that Riker is not the one at fault here. At the end of Riker's perspective, though, the chief inspector shows Riker shooting a phaser back at the station and destroying it before he beams and gets out of there. It's a pretty damning moment for Riker and his testimony, and it's a great moment. It leads to a tense commercial break. But it certainly doesn't help Riker at all. The second perspective we get to see is the widow's perspective. The first thing that she says before they even get started is that she knows that Riker did it.
I just know he did it. He killed my husband.
Okay, so we know where this is going. From the wife's perspective, Riker is pushy, Riker sexually assaults her, and he threatens Federation retaliation in terms of this science project.
If you report this, you'll be making a terrible mistake, Doctor.
In her perspective, she is a delightful, perfect hostess. Riker suggests that they stay on the station. In her perspective, Riker shuts the door, and Riker grabs her, and he undresses her. In her perspective, Apgar swings, but Riker blocks it. Riker does not like what's said about him, but Deanna Troi confirms her side of the story, which also does not bode very well for Riker. Things are not going Riker's way, and Picard is worried. But there's still one more deposition, and that's from Dr. Apgar's assistant, Tana. Now, Picard makes a great legal objection. He says, "Inspector, this is hearsay."
Computer.
Inspector, this is hearsay.
The chief inspector says, "Well, it's admissible in our court of law." And Picard has this great moment where he says, "We'll watch this evidence."
We'll watch this evidence and we'll weigh it accordingly.
And give it the weight that it's due. So we get the scientist's perspective. And from Dr. Apgar's perspective, Riker and Manua, the widow, are passionate about each other. They both want each other so much, and he walks in on them making out together. In Apgar's version, he hits Riker, and Riker calls him a dead man. So this is also damning to Riker based on this testimony from this objective scientist.
Well, let's get on with it, shall we?
Apgar is anxious and paranoid in every deposition.
Riker, what is Starfleet doing here anyway? My delivery wasn't scheduled for another 3 months.
The very minor subplot of this episode is that radiation is damaging the Enterprise, and Wesley, Geordi, and Data are able to determine what's causing the radiation. They also know who killed Dr. Apgar. They tell Picard, but they don't tell us. And so we've got to wait a commercial break. And one thing that I love about this episode is that Picard does not give his customary Picard speech. In A Matter of Perspective, Picard makes a presentation. And in his presentation, he provides evidence from first the Manua deposition, then the Manua deposition again, the Riker deposition, the Tana deposition, and the Riker deposition. Again, Picard's arc is that he needs to be able to put together all the pieces of this puzzle. Apgar had already created the Krieger waves before Starfleet arrived. He lied to them and said that he needed more time, but in actuality, he had already created what the Enterprise came to check on. Apgar lied to Riker and Geordi, and Apgar tried to kill Riker because he thought that Riker already knew. But we all know that Riker didn't know because Riker doesn't do science.
Do you assist your husband in his work?
Oh, dear, no, I'm no scientist.
No, neither am I.
Geordi lines up the end of Picard's presentation with a Krieger wave that is going to actually hit the Enterprise and cause the destruction of the space station. And when the space station blows up from the inside and only the holodeck is left, it's a really great special effect. One of my favorites in the entire series. It's a really cool moment, and we get to cut over, and Picard wraps up his presentation showing that, in fact, Dr. Apgar killed himself.
Dr. Apgar killed himself during his attempt to kill Commander Riker.
And regardless of what happened between Riker and the Widow, Riker is innocent of the crime. And at the very end of this episode, the Chief Inspector withdraws his request and he apologizes to Riker, which I think is really important because I think today we don't do enough apologizing.
My apologies.
I think it's really important in this day and age that people apologize to one another. And in Star Trek, people apologize all the time. I've got a couple other episodes where apologies take place. And I think that our society needs a little bit more apology and a little less trying to just be right in every circumstance. So my number 3 pick is A Matter of Perspective. My number 3 pick for Star Trek The Next Generation is A Matter of Perspective.
But he will be given a chance to prove his innocence.